Hey, I'm Kayla. My name is Kayla Begay, and I'm going to go ahead and talk about morphology of the grammar of words today for a part of Breath of Life Institute, July 2020. My background is in linguistics, and I'm a Native American Studies professor at Humboldt State University. So today we're going to go ahead and talk about what is morphology, what is it, right? And how do we learn morphology from documentation? I'm going to go ahead and present this in a series of steps that should make it easier for us to understand the morphology of our languages. I'm going to go ahead and present some challenges because sometimes the documentation and this process is not always straightforward and easy, but I want to present some common themes, some common challenges that you might encounter based on the documentation. Why is morphology useful? We'll go ahead and talk about that for a moment and then give some ideas for morphology practice. So what is morphology? Morphology is the study of words and word structure. Therefore, it's the study of how words are formed. And because, words share these parts with other words, it's the study of words' relationship to other words. Morphology studies the parts of words, and so these parts of words have names, such as roots, which can be maybe the smallest unit of sound and meaning, but at the core of a word, if you will. Stems tend to be roots plus maybe one or more parts, a little more complex than roots, but it's still a core meaning. And then what do you attach to those roots and stems? Well, those terms can be things such as prefixes, which attach to the prefixes, which attach before roots, which come before roots in the word. Suffixes, which come after roots or stems. I'm going to go ahead and throw this word out there, themes. Sometimes a series is required, and at least in Dene languages that I study, it's more like a string of beads that, in order to form a word, these are required, and it's still the core meaning. Basically, what we're looking at, though, is what constitutes a word and what are the parts, right, in your language. Basically, morphology is the grammar of words. So language can teach us grammar, right? A lot of times we think of this word grammar, we think of having to go to grammar school, right? and learning how to write and read. However, we're learning language, obviously, from the time we're little and even before that, like before we're born. Everything that we're hearing, we're learning the grammar of our language. And documentation, however, for those of us who haven't been able to hear the language, is really important in teaching us grammar too. So words have grammar inside them, and this becomes apparent when I show you a word like this, which in Wailaki means I got my breath back. Nahesidich. Go ahead and say that. Nahesidich. Now this word, if I'm going to go ahead and look at all the meaningful parts, it looks something like this. In Dene languages, the root or most core meaning often is at the end of a word. So here we have yich, and so we see that means breath or breathe. What we have coming before that is a series of prefixes. So English oftentimes doesn't have a lot of parts to words as much as, for example, Dene languages, which an entire word can encode what would be in English a sentence. There's a lot that the word carries in it, whereas English, each of these parts can stand on their own. In Wailaki, each of these parts has to be attached to something in order to form meaning and be understood. So we take this Wailaki word, and if we look at it, the meaning, right, is something like a sentence, but it's one word. How do we know that? Well, none of these parts can stand on their own. If I just say nah, it doesn't mean anything. If I just say hey, it doesn't mean anything. But if you put them all together, they have meaning, and that forms a word. Within that word, there's different parts, and those parts are called morphemes. There's 6 different morphemes here, which you can see by the different colors. All a morpheme is the smallest unit of sound and meaning. Now take the English sentence, right? It's one sentence. It's got 5 words to it. However, each of those words just pretty much stands on their own. It doesn't have a lot of internal parts to it. So what we have is 5 words, 5 morphemes. Now, if I change this sentence and I said, I didn't get my breath back, we'd still have one sentence. We'd have 6 words, but we'd have 7 morphemes, right? Because we can break down the word didn't into 2 meaningful morphemes, did and nt. Now, did can stand on its own, right? It can be a word on its own. However, nt, if I just say nt, doesn't stand on its own, right? It doesn't have any meaning, and so it has to attach to did. However, it's its own morpheme. Looking at this word again, this Wailaki word, if I took each part and reordered the English to what that actual order is in the word, you can see that it's not the same as English. It's important the order of things too, whether it's a sentence or word. Again, a morpheme is the smallest meaning and sound unit, and there's rules to the order of these morphemes. So how do we learn morphology from documentation? I first worked in Breath of Life with Tichetsa Thalili. She, back in 2012, was wanting to look at Seten Beden dialect of Wailaki language. And then the following year, 2 years that Breath of Life was offered, Cheryl Tuttle and Rolinda Want worked with Justin Spence and Lorenzo Lambertino. And I just want to go ahead and foreground this in saying that we made it a lot easier to work with our documentation by digitizing copies, which is basically something that's already been done for you here, where there's pictures and there's scans of the physical documentation, right? Like the pieces of paper are now on a computer. From there, what can make it a lot easier to work with those materials is if someone or a team, as we have here, transcribes and types up what's in that documentation so it can be easily searched. And so we've used Google Docs, spreadsheets, etc. And from that, we're able to work faster through the documentation as opposed to just going through and looking at each paper each time, right? We can, if it's on a computer typed up, we can search like Control F a lot easier for certain things. And from there, we can look at patterns. And I'm going to go ahead and present some steps on how to look for patterns and how to learn morphology from documentation. This is an example of some documentation on Wailaki, and this is where that word nahesi diich comes from. It's the very first line here. It's hard to read, right? So to make it easier, going through and typing some of these things, it's a longer project, but it can make it easier to work with. Here you can see nahesi diich. I got my breath back from image 35 in the note card set, and 201 through 300. There's like 400 note cards that we have to work with. And handwritten texts, again, really hard to kind of go through, but if you type them up, it's easier to go back and search through the texts and to look at the words that you need to look at. So step 1, find 3 to 5 words or sentences with related words. So I'm going to go ahead and present this note card. So from that note card, I can go ahead and select 3 to 5 words or sentences, which mean I paddle around, you paddle around, we paddle around, you, plural, so you all, y'all paddle around. And so that would be nash tang, nan tang, nah de tang, nah tang. Step 2, write down each word or sentence like this. And so I'm going to go ahead and have sentence, B, C, D, translation. So I've done that with the words that you see here, nash tang, all the way on down, right? I paddle around, you paddle around, we paddle around, you all paddle around. So I also have numbered these just to kind of keep track of them. Step 3, look for what is the same in the words or sentences and translations. So if I'm using words here and I'm looking at these words, what is the same across all of them, right? And so we find these 2 segments here, na and tang, as well as the meaning paddle around across all 4 examples. So step 4, write the morpheme on the second line for all words that have it, include any dashes. So you'll see I've done that here, but I've skipped a step. I went ahead because I know something about this language. I know that roots can change a little bit with information about person, number, and also time. It would take me a lot of time to show you how I figured that out. To save time, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that, but to have figured that out, I would have had to have done a lot of comparison like this across different words and roots to know that. But just to know that right now, that's why I'm doing that. So step 5, write the meaning of the morpheme on the third line, including any dashes, right? So the meaning of this is paddle, is the core meaning is paddle, right? But what I've done here is do a paddle 1 and paddle 2. That's just for the sake of time at the moment. Now, step 6, repeat steps 3 through 5 until you have found all the same morphemes. So I have here listed, look for what is the same, write the morpheme, write the meaning, right? So we also have this na, and what does it mean, right? So I'm going to go ahead and write it down, but we aren't quite sure yet. It's a little challenging, but if I look at other words that have this na in them, sure enough, it looks like they all have this meaning of around. And so I'm going to go ahead and put that down as around in step 5, write the meaning. Now, if I look in examples 3 and 4, we also have here, which looks like an apostrophe. In the documentation, I've found out that that actually has like an H sound. So not only do we have that apostrophe in 3 and 4, but what is the same about the translation? If we look at 3 and 4, they involve more than one person, right? And so 1 and 2 only involves one person. I paddle around, you paddle around, right? Those are only one person. But if I look at 3 and 4, we, it's a group. You, all, it's a group. I'm going to go ahead and write down the meaning of that sound as all. And you can see that there. Now that fills out the word for 4, but we still have other parts left, right? And nothing is the same. So I think we've repeated steps 3 through 5 until we found all the same morphemes. Step 7, look at what is different and remains. Can you find meaning? And so it's actually tied up nicely here. If sh means I, d means we, and the n there means you, right? That's all that remains there. And each of it is different in form, but also different in meaning. So these must be the morphemes that are left. So there's one last step, which would be to make a list of morphemes. So again, you're looking at form, meaning, but also where they're at in the word in relationship to the root. And so what I would also do there is organize by type if you can. So we have here na, which means around. It's a prefix, so I've put the dash here because it's going to attach before the root. We know that's a prefix because it comes before the root, so we put a dash there. Organized by type, I've learned that that's an adverbial prefix. It adds information about how something is done. It's done around something, right? So how something is done, usually that has something to do with an adverb. And again, it's a prefix because it comes before the root. Next, we have person marking, right? And where we have the meanings, the morphemes that mean I, you, and all. They're prefixes because they come before the root. So we put dashes for them here and we list them so. And then we have the verb roots, right? And Wailaki roots, again, they change a little bit as far as person, number, and time information. Here I'm just showing paddle 1 and paddle 2, but I'm listing them here as well. So step 9, find more sentences and repeat steps 2 through 8. So if you go exhaustively through your documentation, it can take some time, right? But it helps to have things typed up And also, by the time you're done, you have something that looks like a dictionary, only maybe then instead of, whole words, rather what you're looking at too is all the word parts. So challenges, and we've definitely had challenges just looking in that data, right? It's important to know that some morphemes are not part of the English translation, and you may need to make another list of other words or examples to understand what a morpheme means. So if you take the list that we have, like I'm only using those 4 words, right? Sometimes it's still important to look back at another list to figure out that part or why it looks a certain way. So for example, Wailaki, that example of nah de tongue, we had to look at another list of na words to figure out, yes, for sure, that means around. In the English, and then in the English translation, it says we paddle around, but all wasn't necessarily a part of that translation, right? It's just, we had to figure that out. Other challenges, sometimes the meaning is in the lack of a morpheme, and sometimes a morpheme has a function in pronunciation but has no meaning. So I'm going to go ahead and show you some more examples from Wailaki. So here we have the words I cry, you cry, he cries, we cry. Ishche, inche, itche, itche. So itche, we cry, right? You'll notice if I went through that process that we just did, steps 1 through 8, we would get this. But you'll notice for he cries, there's nothing to mark the he in it, right? Sometimes the meaning is in the lack of a morpheme. If you don't see something there, and maybe it's the fact that it's not there that we infer that meaning. So the lack of a morpheme. If you see this in Dene languages, it's really common. The he or she form doesn't have a morpheme on it, but we infer from that you're talking about he or she. Now from this data, sometimes a morpheme has a function in pronunciation but has no meaning. In each of these words, because there's no adverbial prefix before it to say how it's done, instead, what we have there is this prefix I. And the reason we have it is it just helps pronounce the word. It doesn't have a meaning. It's just helpful to pronouncing the word. Otherwise, we'd be saying shche, nche, che, diche. Wailaki, for some reason, doesn't like that, just like Hupa. Wailaki, for some reason, doesn't like that. It wants another segment in front of it. It wants another sound in front of it. And so there's a rule there that if you don't have an adverbial prefix before it, you're going to go ahead and insert this I sound. Although it doesn't have a meaning, it doesn't have a translation. It just helps pronounce the word. Other challenges, some morphemes change depending on their environment. They're shape-shifting depending on what's around them. And we can see this sometimes. What's changing them is the surrounding sounds. So for example, English cats and dogs, we have the word cats. It has 2 morphemes, cat and s is attached to the cat, right? It can't stand on its own. And we have dogs, right? Dogs. Wait a minute. It's not the same, right? So we have a Z sound for plural dogs and an S sound for plural cats. What's happening is that S is voiceless and is following a voiceless T, right? So cats, you can feel it, no vibration. Do that with dogs. Dogs, it's voiced because it's following something voiced. So that morpheme that's plural is changing depending on the surrounding sounds. Sometimes morphemes change depending on the surrounding morphemes and meaning. And we see this with Wailaki, I paddle around, and I did paddle around. So we have nash tunk for I paddle around, nasi tunk for I did paddle around. Basically, what you have in nasi tunk is that there's a change in time information with this morpheme S. It's meaning it's perfective. It means it's emphasizing that the activity ended. And then following that, we don't have a sh sound anymore. We have a long E sound, E. So the part that means I shape shifts from a sh to an E or an E to a sh depending on whether or not that perfective morpheme is before it. So we have nasi tunk and nash tunk. It's shape-shifting because of the surrounding morphemes, and that's real consistent throughout the language. Other challenges: some morphemes change depending on the type of word or sentence. Some morphemes change depending on their environment of the type of word or sentence. And so, for example, in karuk, the part that means we depends on whether or not the whole sentence is positive or negative. So we have pukin apun muti ara, or nu apun muti. We didn't know, or we know. So with negative sentences, you get kin, and positive sentences, you get nu. Both of them mean we, but you have to know which one to use depending on that environment. So why is morphology useful? So apart from knowing which morphemes go where and what contexts to use them, if you understand the parts of words, you can fill gaps in the documentation based on these patterns. So let's say you have a list and you know where certain morphemes go. Even if that particular word isn't found in the list, you have a good guess for how to make that word, right? You can also create new words for things that didn't exist in the language before based on patterns in the language, knowing the rules of how to put words together. So for morphology practice, for beginners, I recommend trying all the steps with maybe 2 to 3 simpler words or sentences, and your linguistic partner can help determine which may be good to start with. For another practice, you could find 2 to 3 long words or sentences in your language and see if you can find all the morphemes. For more advanced practice, I'd recommend composing a word or sentence based on what morphemes you know. Thank you.